probably will be extremely useful for protecting family farms.
Very much so.
Thanks, and we look forward to making sure as the bill moves through all the committees of being useful to you.
Thank you, Senator, for coming here to the Adirondacks and for your leadership on the Clean Energy Jobs and American Power Act. I have before me your testimony where you made a very strong case for ensuring that the Clean Air Act continued to apply to coal-burning power plants. About 2/3 of the acid deposition problem in the Adirondacks is attributable to about 80 coal-burning power plants in the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys. And throughout the years of the Bush administration, our organization had to file 3 major lawsuits to continue the programs of new source review and the mercury enforcement provisions of the Clean Air Act. And we were fortunate that we were able to win all of those lawsuits, including 2 that eventually were decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. There is a close relationship between climate change and acid rain and mercury. We're finding that as acid rain alters the Adirondack environment, for example, one of the reasons that some of the recovery that we expected from the 1990 provisions of the Clean Air Act in our lakes has not occurred is that the whole process of neutralization of that acid that's falling 365 days a year, dry and wet, over the Adirondacks, about 50% of the soil calcium that we started out with is gone. You know, calcium that took eons to weather is gone. And we're facing a situation where the Adirondacks, as it warms, is more threatened by exotic pests like the Asian longhorn beetle, the emerald ash borer, the Cyrus wood wasp, and even a diverse ecosystem like the Adirondacks, where its trees are weakened by the lack of calcium, where its trees are weakened by the release of, as the amount of calcium goes down in that chemical process in the soils, aluminum is released. And we've lost about half of the mature red spruce here in the park.
The aluminum kills the tree?
That's correct. Yeah, it interferes. Scientists believe that it interferes with the shutdown process for winter, so the tree is more more vulnerable to cold temperatures in the winter. So about Charlie Driscoll of the Hubbard book has estimated that about 2/3 of the mercury deposition in New York is attributable to those power plants that frankly, your efforts kept the Clean Air Act applying to, and if the House version is amended to contain similar protection, that's going to be very good news for the Adirondacks. About 96% of our Adirondack lakes exceed EPL threat levels for methylmercury.
And there's still a restriction, you can only eat 1 fish a month.
Yes, and interestingly enough, that applies to all of the New York City reservoirs.
It's disgraceful.
So, it's a very, very serious situation. We have 6 times the mercury levels in our water bodies compared to 1900. And 1 in 12 women in New York of childbearing age have mercury bloodstream levels that are unsafe in terms of the children that they will bear. So it really is a very serious situation, and it is critical that whatever federal legislation addresses climate change, it also preserves our legal options. About 25 lawsuits in the federal courts are moving forward under the Clean Air Act, and we expect that nearly all of those coal-burning power plants that are responsible for our acid rain and mercury will basically be remediated if those lawsuits can continue to go forward.
Right.
So, great job.
Well, I just want to thank you guys for your advocacy. All of you work every day with my staff, and we're very well aware of the concerns. I support Carper's bill, and the challenge there is how do we make sure it gets passed in its form, because we don't want to water down acid rain provision. And Chairman Boxer has said she's only allowed amendments that have 100% Democratic support, and so we have a lot of Midwesterners who are not going to support it. So some of the strategic ideas, or maybe it's something we could get better through in conference or in a standalone bill, even if we just have an up or down vote. So right now we're working on how do you get this done and how do you actually get it part of the bill. in an effective way. And that's where we're spending a lot of time focusing our energies, because we want acid rain covered. We want to make sure the Adirondacks in New York State are protected. Our biggest battle is the one you've identified, though, just to make sure we have Clean Air Act regulatory authority, because the House wasn't able to do it, and the Senate, we've been able to preserve that placeholder. So that would probably go to conference as well, and that's where our battle is really going to be. So we have a number of battles that are very important for New York, but the good news is that Chairman Boxer really does allow the members on the committee to have priorities, and she really respects those priorities, and that is my number one priority right now, is just to make sure Clean Air Act is governs.
I think you're going to have a little leverage, because in one of the lawsuits, we basically got the Clean Air Mercury rule stricken. So now I think you have an opportunity with EPA Director or Administrator Lisa Jackson. The EPA is under has to release the new mercury regs, and the mercury regs are, they're justified under current law. And if industry, the coal burning power plants that don't have any flue gas scrubbers or any pollution control technology on them, if they have to put technology on for mercury,
yeah,
they're going to put it on for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen.
Exactly.
So I think maybe working with the administrator, Senator, if we can get those regs out.
And if you can combine it with the tax credit, if you can incentivize these businesses to clean for all of it at the same time, with more generous tax breaks for companies that do that, the sooner they do it, I think we can also incentivize them. You can do it on both sides.
I think so too.
And that's the kind of work that we're still doing right now as we negotiate this bill. And I'm going to try to make it as possible for people to agree that this is a priority with me. Even if it's tough on their states, we can create offset opportunities through tax credits for companies that decide to be clean and to put in those changes.
As David mentioned, New York State has always led the way in this from the time of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and the Clean Air Act in 1980,
Yeah.
and the cap and trade approach. I think you have a wonderful pulpit to say, let's deal with acid rain and climate change in the same bill, and do a belts and suspender approach where we can bring it down by law that provides certainty to industry, at the same time that Administrator Jackson at the EPA provides a regulatory approach, which is a lot more painful to industry than a straightforward law.
I understand.
Yeah, and if I can say, the difference between the two, a regulatory approach and a law, we have a very long and consistent record, and whenever EPA promulgates the rules, the lawsuits just spring up. And poor Neil here's got better things to do than be arguing in court constantly. But if you look at the interstate rule and all the other rules, when it comes out of EPA, it gets tied up in court, sometimes for decades.
That's true.
So,
as we know with our Superfund site.
exactly. That's a different statute, but exactly the same dynamic. That's right.
At this point, I'd like to open to questions from the audience. If folks have questions let's start with the Senator, please. Members of the press.
Yeah, what kind of acceptable, what kind of levels would you like to see in the Senate legislation and even House legislation? What kind of levels of reduction and over what kind of timeline?
Well, we want 20% carbon reductions by 2020. That's really what we're fighting for, and 80% by 2050, I think is what the standard is that we put forward. And I think that's a very good step in the right direction. We could always want higher reductions, but I think if we can get consensus on 20% by 2020, that's a very strong step in the right direction.
We have the technology, for example, to remove 90% of the mercury from the flue gas streams of the coal burning power plants, and I think that definitely should be the standard. And we could remove
90% of mercury.
90% of mercury. That should be the standard.
By.
Well, the technology's here, and
By
given
tomorrow.
given the tax incentives that you suggested,
Yeah.
I think we could do that by 2015.
Perhaps Neil or Brian, you could explain the difference between reasonably the two standards that have to be met generally on the federal level are reasonably available control technology or maximum achievable